Imagine standing in a London market in the year 1810. You're a factory worker, your hands are rough, your coat is thin, and in your pocket you carry exactly one day's wages. You want to buy sugar, just a single pound of it. You hand over every coin you earned that morning, every penny of a full day's labour, and walk home with a small paper parcel that fits in the palm of your hand. Now fast forward 90 years. It is 1900. That same London worker stirs sugar into his tea not once, not twice, but 3 times a day, barely giving it a second thought. The same substance that once cost a man his entire daily wage now costs him almost nothing. How does something go from treasure to triviality in less than a century? How does a product that kings once locked in iron chests end up dissolved in the morning cup of a tired labourer? That is not just a story about economics. It is one of the most dramatic transformations in all of human history, and it begins not in England, not in the Caribbean, not in the courts of medieval Europe, but on a small island in the Pacific, 10,000 years ago. The island is New Guinea. The year is approximately 8,000 before the Common Era. A man reaches down and snaps a thick green stalk from the ground. He puts it to his mouth and bites. A wave of sweetness floods his tongue. Intense, almost shocking, unlike anything that nature usually offers so freely. He bites again. He shares the stalk with others. They remember the spot. They come back. For thousands of years, that was the entire story of sugar. No processing, no refining, no trade. Just a plant, a bite, and a moment of pure pleasure. Sugarcane spread slowly across the Pacific and into Southeast Asia, carried by migrating peoples who prized it the way others prized salt or fire, as one of the basic good things of life. But it was wild. It was raw. It was local. Everything changed in India. Around 3,500 years before the Common Era, someone in the Indian subcontinent discovered something extraordinary. If you crushed sugarcane and slowly heated the juice, boiling it down patiently hour after hour over an open flame, the liquid would thicken, crystallize, and harden into something that could be stored, transported, and traded. A perishable plant became a permanent product. The Indians called it khanda, and from that one word across centuries of trade routes and borrowed languages, the entire English world would eventually inherit the word candy. This was not a small invention. This was a revolution. For the first time in history, sweetness could travel. It could be packaged, measured, sold, and sent across deserts and seas. Sugar was no longer just a plant you chewed by a riverbank. It was a commodity. And the ancient world took notice. In 326 BC, Alexander the Great led his army through what is now Pakistan. His soldiers, battle-hardened men who had marched across half the known world, encountered something that stopped them in their tracks. Not an enemy army, but a crop they had never seen. They called it the reed that gives honey without bees. They tasted it. They marvelled at it. And then, like so many things Alexander touched, it became a footnote. Extraordinary, exotic, but not yet within reach of ordinary life. In Rome, sugar arrived eventually, carried by traders along the Silk Road and the spice routes of the Indian Ocean. But if you wanted to buy it, you went not to a market stall but to an apothecary, a pharmacy. Sugar was medicine. It was prescribed by physicians. It sat on shelves beside herbs and minerals, available to those wealthy enough to afford it. The price was staggering. A single pound could cost a skilled Roman labourer an entire month's wages. Sugar was not food. It was a luxury so rare it bordered on the magical. For centuries it stayed that way in the Western world, heard of, whispered about, occasionally glimpsed, but never truly possessed except by the very rich. Then came the Arabs. Between the 7th and 13th centuries, the Islamic world underwent an agricultural revolution that historians have only recently begun to fully appreciate. Arab scholars, merchants, and engineers carried crops across an enormous territory, stretching from Persia to Spain, and among those crops sugarcane was king. They did not merely grow it, they mastered it. Arab chemists and engineers refined the processing techniques inherited from India, built sophisticated crushing mills powered by water and wind, and developed methods of purification that produced increasingly white, increasingly pure crystals of sugar. They built sugar industries in Persia, in Egypt, in Sicily, in Morocco, and in what is today southern Spain. They created trade networks. They wrote scientific treatises. They made sugar more available than it had ever been, though still, by any modern standard, breathtakingly expensive. And then history delivered sugar to Europe in the most unlikely of ways, through armies. When the Crusaders rode into the Holy Land in the 11th and 12th centuries, they were looking for glory, for salvation, for the liberation of Jerusalem. What they found, among other things, was sugarcane growing in the fields of what is now Lebanon and Israel. They tasted it. They were stunned. European chronicles from the period describe soldiers sucking on cane stalks with the wonder of children encountering something entirely new, which for them it essentially was. They sent sugar home. And Europe, which had been sweetening its food with honey since the beginning of time, caught its first real taste of what was coming. The city that moved fastest was Venice. Positioned at the crossroads of Eastern and Western trade, the Venetians understood immediately what sugar could mean. They established a near-total monopoly on the European sugar trade that would last for nearly 200 years. Venetian merchants bought sugar in the East, refined it in their workshops, and sold it at enormous profit to the courts and castles of Europe. And in those courts, sugar became something beyond food. It became theatre. It became power. Medieval European rulers used sugar the way modern governments use military parades, as a demonstration of might. At the wedding of King Henry III of France, guests were served sculptures carved entirely from sugar, castles, lions, ships, entire landscapes of crystallized sweetness, 300 pounds of sugar consumed in a single celebration. At a time when that same sugar could fund a small army, the message was unmistakable. We have so much wealth that we eat it. Sugar sat in royal treasuries alongside gold and silver. It was given as diplomatic gifts between monarchs. Apothecaries across Europe sold it by the gram, wrapped in paper, to the wealthy sick who believed it could heal almost anything. The world had decided sugar was worth anything. It had no idea yet what anything would actually mean. There is a simple, brutal equation at the heart of the next chapter of sugar's story. Europe wanted more. The plant grew only in the tropics, and the tropics were far away, the work was backbreaking, and the climate was lethal to European labourers. Something had to give, and what gave, what was sacrificed on the altar of European sweetness, was the freedom and the lives of millions of human beings. But the machinery of that catastrophe was assembled slowly, piece by piece, almost logically, the way terrible things often are. It began with geography and ambition. By the 15th century, Portugal was the most aggressive exploring nation on earth. Her sailors pushed further south along the African coast every decade, searching for trade routes, for gold, for advantage. And along the way they discovered islands, Madeira, the Canaries, São Tomé, small volcanic outcroppings in the Atlantic with rich soil, warm temperatures and reliable rainfall. Perfect, it turned out, for sugarcane. The Portuguese planted, they built mills, and they needed workers. At first, they used convicts, men condemned by the courts and sent to the islands as forced labour in lieu of execution. Then they brought workers from the Portuguese mainland under contract. But the islands were disease-ridden, the work was savage, and free workers, even contracted ones, had a stubborn habit of dying, escaping, or demanding better conditions. The planters needed something else. They needed a workforce that could be owned. The answer came from the African continent, where Portuguese traders had already established contact with local rulers and slave markets along the coast. Enslaved Africans began arriving on the sugar islands in growing numbers through the middle of the 15th century. The island of São Tomé became the first full-scale laboratory for what the world would come to know as the plantation system, a total organisation of land, labour and violence designed around a single crop. By 1500, São Tomé was producing more sugar than all of Cyprus and Sicily combined. The experiment had worked. The template was ready. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed west and found the Caribbean. On his second voyage, in 1493, he brought sugarcane cuttings with him, tucked among his supplies like an afterthought, like seeds in a traveller's pocket. He planted them in what is now the Dominican Republic. they grew magnificently. The Caribbean climate was not merely suitable for sugarcane. It was, by almost every agricultural measure, ideal. The islands received exactly the right rainfall, the right sunlight, the right temperatures. The soil was deep and fertile, and the Caribbean was, compared to Asia, relatively close to the consuming markets of Europe. Within decades, Spanish colonists recognized what they had. Within a century, the Caribbean had become the engine of the global sugar trade, and within 2 centuries it had become the site of the largest forced migration in human history. The demand was insatiable. As sugar prices gradually fell through the 16th and 17th centuries, still expensive but inching closer to the reach of the European middle class, consumption rose sharply. England, France, the Netherlands, Portugal and Spain all raced to establish their own Caribbean colonies. Barbados, Jamaica, Haiti, Cuba, Martinique, Guadeloupe. Each island became, in essence, a sugar factory, and each factory ran on human suffering. To understand what that suffering looked like, you have to understand what producing sugar actually demanded. It began in the fields, where cane had to be cut by hand. The stalks grew tall and dense, with razor-sharp leaves that sliced skin at every swing. Workers moved through the rows in the suffocating tropical heat, cutting with heavy blades from before dawn until after dark. The work was relentless. Cane had to be processed within hours of cutting before the juice began to ferment and spoil, which meant there was no slack in the schedule, no waiting for tomorrow. From the fields, the cane went to the mill, where it was fed between enormous grinding rollers powered by wind, water, or animal labour. The rollers were unforgiving. They cared nothing for the difference between a cane stalk and a human hand. Accidents were so common, so expected, that mill operators kept a sharp blade hanging near the machinery for a specific purpose. If a worker's hand was caught in the rollers, someone had to act immediately. Waiting for the machine to stop meant losing an arm, or more. The only option was to act fast. From the mill, the juice flowed to the boiling house. Here, in rooms where temperatures reached 60 degrees Celsius, workers fed fires under massive copper vats and stirred the thickening liquid through stage after stage of evaporation and clarification. The heat was staggering. Burns were constant. The work continued around the clock during the harvest season, with workers rotating in shifts that allowed almost no rest. This was the system. This was what sugar required. And for roughly 300 years, it was powered almost entirely by enslaved Africans, taken from their homes, transported across the Atlantic in conditions of almost unimaginable misery, and worked until they could work no more. The numbers are almost too large to hold in the mind. Across roughly 3 centuries of the Atlantic slave trade, approximately 12 million African men, women, and children were loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. Scholars estimate that somewhere between 10 and 20% died during the crossing alone, lost to disease, starvation, and despair on voyages that could last 2 months. Those who survived arrived to a life expectancy, on many Caribbean sugar plantations, of less than 10 years, 12 million people for sugar. Yet the greatest sugar colony the world had ever seen was the French territory of Saint-Domingue, on the western half of the island of Hispaniola, what is today Haiti. By the 1780s, this single colony, roughly the size of the state of Maryland, was producing nearly half of all the sugar consumed in Europe, along with enormous quantities of coffee and indigo. It was, by the standards of the time, a miracle of productivity. It was also a powder keg. The enslaved population of Saint-Domingue outnumbered the free population by more than 10 to 1. The conditions were among the harshest in the Caribbean, so harsh that the colony required a constant stream of new arrivals from Africa just to maintain its workforce, because the death rate was so high that natural population growth was impossible. The planters knew this. They calculated it. They decided it was cheaper to work people to death and replace them than to treat them in ways that might allow them to survive. In 1791, they discovered the cost of that calculation. On the night of August 22nd, 1791, in the hills above the northern plain, the enslaved people of Saint-Domingue rose in rebellion. What began as an uprising became a revolution, the only successful slave revolution in recorded history. For 13 years, through battles against the French colonial army, against a Spanish invasion, against an expedition sent by Napoleon Bonaparte himself, one of the most formidable military forces in the world at the time, the people of Saint-Domingue fought and won. On January 1st, 1804, the independent nation of Haiti was declared. The men and women who had been enslaved to produce Europe's sugar had created the first free black republic in the history of the world. The sugar industry of Saint-Domingue collapsed entirely, and across Europe the price of sugar spiked overnight. Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807, and slavery itself in 1833. The story is often told as a triumph of moral progress, and in important ways it was, but the details are uncomfortable. When Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act, it included financial compensation of £20 million sterling, an almost incomprehensible sum, equivalent to roughly 40% of the entire British government's annual budget. That compensation went to the plantation owners. The people who had been enslaved received nothing. Not a pound, not an acre, not an apology. Britain then turned to a new solution. Indentured workers from India and China brought to the Caribbean under contracts that bound them to years of labour in conditions that, while not legally slavery, were often remarkably close to it. The fields still needed workers. The world still wanted sugar. The machinery kept running with different fuel. By 1850, the average British worker was consuming roughly 9 kilograms of sugar a year, a figure that would have seemed impossible, almost fantastical to someone living a century earlier. Sugar had come down from the tables of kings to the cups of factory hands. It had made that journey across the bodies of millions. The sweetness had a price. It always had. Most of the people who paid it never got to choose. There is a particular kind of power that hides in plain sight. Not the power of armies or empires. That kind announces itself with flags and cannons. This is quieter. It sits in your kitchen cabinet. It dissolves in your morning coffee. It lines the shelves of every grocery store in every city on earth. And by the time most people began to understand what it was doing to them, it had already been doing it for generations. This is the third act of sugar's story. The slaves are gone. The empires are fading. But sugar is just getting started. The year is 1806. Napoleon Bonaparte, master of most of continental Europe, is furious. The British Royal Navy has blockaded French ports, cutting off the flow of Caribbean sugar to France and her allies. The streets of Paris, which had grown accustomed to sweetness, are suddenly without it. Napoleon, who understood that armies march on their stomachs, and that civilian morale is as important as military strategy, faced a problem. How do you feed a continent's appetite for sugar when the ships that carry it are being turned back at sea? His answer was the sugar beet. European scientists had known for decades that the common beetroot contained sucrose, the same molecule as cane sugar. But extraction had always seemed impractical, uneconomical, not worth the trouble when Caribbean cane was available. Napoleon made it worth the trouble by decree. He ordered the cultivation of sugar beet across France, funded research into extraction techniques, and established the world's first beet sugar factories. The results were crude at first. The sugar was darker, the yields were lower, but the principle was proven. When the Napoleonic Wars ended and Caribbean sugar returned to European markets, beet sugar retreated. But it did not disappear. It waited. And over the following decades, as the Industrial Revolution transformed manufacturing across Europe, the technology of sugar beet processing improved with extraordinary speed. Steam-powered mills replaced hand labour. Chemical refinement techniques produced purer and purer crystals. Railway networks carried raw beets to factories and finished sugar to cities with an efficiency that sailing ships and hand mills could never match. By the 1880s, Europe was producing more sugar from beets than it was importing from the tropics. The price of sugar, already falling for 2 centuries, collapsed further. For the first time in 10,000 years of human history, sugar became genuinely cheap. Cheap enough that even the poorest urban workers could afford it not as an occasional treat, but as a daily staple. The world had crossed a threshold, and no one fully understood what lay on the other side. In Britain, the transformation was particularly dramatic and particularly deliberate. The British government of the mid-19th century faced a persistent problem with its industrial workforce. Factory work was brutal, monotonous, and exhausting. Workers were underpaid, housed in overcrowded slums and chronically undernourished. Productivity suffered. Unrest simmered. Politicians and industrialists looked for solutions. Sugar, specifically sugar dissolved in tea, turned out to be one of them. Tea had arrived in Britain from China in the 17th century and spread rapidly through all social classes. By the mid-1800s, it was the national drink. And the British habit of drinking tea with sugar was not merely a cultural preference. It was, from a physiological standpoint, a significant caloric supplement for workers who were not getting enough to eat. A cup of heavily sweetened tea provided quick energy, suppressed hunger temporarily, and offered a small, reliable pleasure in an otherwise grim day. The British government recognised this. Through a series of deliberate tariff reductions across the first half of the 19th century, Parliament made imported sugar progressively cheaper. By 1850, the average British worker was drinking 2 cups of sweetened tea per day. By 1900, sugar consumption in Britain had increased by a factor of roughly 20 compared to 2 centuries earlier. Sugar was the fuel of the Industrial Revolution, not for machines, but for the human beings who operated them, and governments helped pump it into the system. Across the Atlantic, the 20th century turned sugar into something new entirely, an industrial ingredient. The story of sugar in modern America is, in large part, the story of how a natural product became a manufactured one, how the crystals of a tropical plant were transformed, processed, hidden, and engineered until they were everywhere and nowhere at once. In the early 1900s, American sugar consumption was already high by historical standards, but it was still recognizable. People bought sugar in bags and added it to things themselves. They knew they were doing it. They could see it happening. Then came the food industry. As packaged and processed foods became a staple of American life through the mid-20th century, sugar followed them inside, into the manufacturing process, invisible to the consumer but essential to the product. Bread, tomato sauce, salad dressing, breakfast cereal, yogurt, canned soup, crackers, peanut butter. Each of these products, in their manufactured forms, contained added sugar in quantities that would have astonished someone buying them in homemade form. By 1970, the average American was consuming 45 kilograms of sugar per year, and a large and growing portion of it was sugar they had not consciously chosen, sugar they did not know was there. And then the industry found something even better than sugar. In the 1970s, Japanese scientists developed a process for converting cornstarch into a liquid sweetener with a fructose content higher than regular sugar. It was cheaper than cane sugar, easier to handle in liquid form, and, crucially, it was derived from corn, which the United States produced in almost incomprehensible quantities, heavily subsidized by the federal government. High fructose corn syrup arrived in American food manufacturing like a tide coming in. By 1984, both Coca-Cola and Pepsi had quietly replaced cane sugar in their flagship drinks with high fructose corn syrup. No announcement, no fanfare. Consumers noticed a slight taste difference and mostly shrugged. What they did not notice, what no one told them, was that they were now consuming a sweetener processed differently by the human body than regular sucrose, in quantities that were steadily, year by year, increasing. Americans were consuming more sugar than ever in history. They just did not know it. But the deepest betrayal was not in the product itself. It was in the science, or rather in what was done to the science. By the 1950s, researchers in the United States and Britain were beginning to accumulate troubling evidence. Studies suggested a correlation between high sugar consumption and elevated rates of heart disease. The data was not yet conclusive, but it was concerning enough to merit serious investigation. One researcher in particular, a British physiologist named John Yudkin, published findings across the 1960s arguing that sugar, not dietary fat, was the primary driver of cardiovascular disease in industrialized nations. The sugar industry watched these developments with alarm, and it responded not with transparency, not with its own research to challenge or refine the findings, but with something far more calculated. In 1967, internal documents, hidden for nearly 50 years and finally published in a scientific journal in 2016, revealed that the Sugar Research Foundation, a trade organization funded by major American sugar producers, had secretly paid 3 Harvard nutrition scientists to publish a review article in a prestigious medical journal. The article, which appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine, systematically minimized the evidence linking sugar to heart disease and redirected suspicion toward dietary fat. The scientists were paid the equivalent, in today's money, of approximately $50,000. Their financial relationship with the sugar industry was not disclosed. The article was published as independent science. The consequences were staggering in their scale and duration. Through the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, the dominant nutritional advice in the United States and much of the Western world was that fat, not sugar, was the enemy. Governments issued dietary guidelines. Food manufacturers reformulated their products. The phrase low fat became synonymous with healthy. Entire industries were built on this premise, and when manufacturers removed fat from products, they replaced it with something else to maintain palatability. They replaced it with sugar. For 3 decades, while the public faithfully bought low-fat yogurt and fat-free cookies and reduced-fat salad dressing, obesity rates climbed. Type 2 diabetes rates climbed. Cardiovascular disease rates climbed. The very diseases that the low-fat revolution had promised to prevent were becoming more prevalent, not less. The documents came to light in 2016. By then, the generations that had grown up under the low-fat paradigm were middle-aged. Today, the numbers are not easy to sit with. The average American adult consumes approximately 17 teaspoons of added sugar every single day. The World Health Organization recommends no more than 6 to 9 teaspoons. The gap between those two figures represents millions of cases of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease, conditions that cost the United States healthcare system hundreds of billions of dollars annually and cost individual human beings years and quality of life. 42% of American adults are currently classified as obese. 37 million Americans live with type 2 diabetes, a disease that, a century ago, was rare enough that most physicians went their entire careers without seeing a significant number of cases. Sugar is not the only factor in these statistics, but it is a central one. And it is a hidden one, tucked into the ingredient lists of products that do not taste sweet, dissolved in sauces and dressings and breads and snacks, renamed in ingredient lists as corn syrup, dextrose, maltose, evaporated cane juice, and dozens of other terms that allow manufacturers to list it further down the label than consumers expect. The pushback has begun, slowly and unevenly. Mexico introduced a sugar tax in 2014 and recorded a 12% reduction in sugary drink consumption within 2 years. Britain introduced a similar levy in 2018, prompting major manufacturers to quietly reformulate their products before the tax took effect. Several American cities have passed taxes on sugary beverages. The global conversation about sugar and public health is louder now than it has ever been. But the industry is large, the lobbying is well funded, and the human taste for sweetness is, as 10,000 years of history have demonstrated, essentially undefeatable. Here is what sugar's full story looks like when you step back far enough to see all of it at once. It begins on a Pacific island, with a man biting a stalk. It moves through the laboratories of ancient India, where crystallization turned a plant into a commodity. It travels the spice roads of the Arab world, arrives in medieval Europe as treasure, and crosses the Atlantic as the economic engine of an empire built on the destruction of human freedom. It fuels the Industrial Revolution, fills the cups of factory workers, and then reinvents itself as a hidden ingredient in a processed food supply that billions of people consume every day without fully understanding what they are eating or why. At every stage of that journey, someone profited. At every stage, someone else paid the price. The planters grew rich. The enslaved people worked until they died. The food corporations posted record profits. The consumers developed diseases they were never told to associate with their breakfast cereal. Sugar did not do any of this by accident. It did it because it is genuinely, neurologically, evolutionarily irresistible, because the human brain, shaped by millions of years of scarcity, is wired to seek out sweetness wherever it can find it, and to keep seeking it long after the need has been satisfied. The industry knew this. It built an empire on it. Right now, there is very likely sugar in your kitchen, probably in more places than you think. It arrived there at the end of a 10,000-year journey that passed through the ruins of civilizations, across the suffering of millions, through the deliberate manipulation of science, and into the grocery bag you carried home last Tuesday. The sweetest thing in your pantry has the most bitter history in the world.